Can you tell us who
Barbara Honegger worked for the Bush-Reagan campaign in 1980 and then quit in a volatile protest of their activities, and has made a crusade out of exposing the October surprise.
We might as well get into this, since this is one of the stories that was covered over by the mainstream media. What was her initial story?
Well, her initial story was that the Reagan-Bush campaign, William Casey, the Reagan-Bush campaign had made a deal with the Iranians to keep the embassy hostage through the elections, and then another 76 days so that Carter wouldn't even get credit for their release, you know, so that Reagan would get the full credit for their release. And they were, in fact, released 2 hours after he was sworn in, which was enough time for the word to get back to Iran that he was, in fact, president. And then, you know, they were the hostages were released. They were actually held at the airport waiting for this confirmation. And then to go back to our other thing we were working on here is why didn't Dukakis take Bush's head off with this stuff, which he could have. God knows, you can see the television commercials or shows, you know, or interview 5-minute segments showing the Noriega link, the Black Eagle, the whole stuff. We had all of this, and we were definitely trying to feed it to them. And what we got back from them was
this is from the Dukakis
campaign. The Dukakis, and we got inside. We got the movie cover-up delivered to them. We got the movie, the PBS Frontline show Guns, Drugs, and the CIA delivered to them. We got in to see them, some of the people in this broad, disorganized group of scholars researching this thing, and we got from them a resistance. They essentially, and feedback, as one of the senior Dukakis people told Jim Driscoll, who's in our community with the America's Peace Test in Nevada, that John Stockwell's facts are all screwed up. And I immediately, what facts? What is it? Because I consider myself, if not an academic, nevertheless a scholar of these things. And so what facts? Because I want to check them out. Because if I am screwed up, I don't, I don't. And they wouldn't give us any details, but they just rejected the stuff out of hand. Now, if you permit me, just very quickly to create a scenario or give you my analysis of what happened. And we note the scandal broke, or was broken, by the establishment in November of '86, the Iran-Contra scandal, and it led to a dismantling of the Reagan White House. And then later they gave him his credibility back with the INF agreement. Now, in the winter of 1987, George Bush was written up by every major columnist as being out of business. He was finished politically. They were saying this openly. George Will was writing columns that the Republican Party was out. The Democrats were clearly going to win the next time around, and they were all writing that George Bush could not survive the Iran-Contra scandal. And this is because they, including the conservative columnists and the establishment press, had this material back then. And they knew about George Bush's involvement in all of this stuff. And the scandal was breaking, and they did not believe that he could survive. By the spring, he had survived to the point, battling, as I put it, to stay out of jail. He had hung in there. He didn't resign or retire. And they began to wonder what the U.S. people's tolerance was of this scandal, how much it would stick. Then they engineered the Iran-Contra hearings in the summer, which were carefully orchestrated by Danny Inouye, the Democrat, in cooperation with the other Democrats, Cohen and Mitchell, for example, who wrote the book Men of Zeal, which they profess to be an expose of behind the scenes, but they do not, in fact, expose. It's a continuation of the cover-up. They do not, for example, discuss their resistance at having of allowing the Black Eagle stuff to be investigated, and their own resistance of having the George Bush drug linkage investigated. So the committee drew a line and said, we won't investigate beyond this line. So they gave the nation the appearance of an airing, and they did not, in fact, probe into the things that would have led them into the impeachment of George Bush. And this had a catharsis effect on the nation. And then we get into the fall and then the winter of '88. And then the spring, and there's still a debate going on in public. Remember Dan Rather, who tried to nail Bush.
Right.
He tried to break this stuff
In
into
that
the
special
open.
CBS interview.
And what happened was the establishment came down on him and said, no, we're not going to go after George Bush. Until eventually, in the summer of '88, when we were once again trying to break this, Bush eventually was able to laugh at the cameras at the Republican convention, because we had journalists, we had found journalists who would ask the questions, who went up on national television and said, what about the Iran-Contra thing? And he just laughed at them and said, I'm not even going to answer those questions anymore. The nation doesn't care about the Iran-Contra scandal. That is history. I've answered those questions. Forget it. Don't ask me anymore. Now, in the meantime, this establishment, this party that we have, the single party state, this fraternity that runs this country, that has two chapters, a Republican and a Democrat, one a little bit more liberal than the other one more conservative, representing the big business interests more directly. That's the Republicans. In terms of their interests, that's the A team. But they always have the B team that they can run out. Jimmy Carter, when Richard Nixon makes the nation too angry, or the nation gets too riled at the Vietnam War, or something like that. This is where they produced Michael Dukakis. He's a team player to the establishment. In order to be accepted as a presidential candidate, he did homage to the arms race. He said eventually that he would give humanitarian aid to the Contras. He would consider it. He said definitely he would give military aid to El Salvador, which means he bought into all the principles of the covert secret government, of the covert operations, of the covert manipulation of the world.
He was singing another song when he was trying to get the Democratic nomination.
That's right. Before, his background was progressive, but he bought in, they screened him into the system, they groomed him into the system. He was advised that he could run, but if he would, so what he was there is, if the nation had clung, its outrage had been sufficient over the Iran-Contra scandal, they had Dukakis standing by, the B team to their interests, and he would give them some grief by spending some money on housing and on medical insurance for people and things like that, which is not their choice of the way to invest the money. They want to invest it in missiles and things where they make greater profits. But he would support the arms race, and he would support the CIA and the covert establishment, the national security state's activities. But then they realized they did not have to go with the B team. The people didn't care. They didn't have to give the nation a B team. So they went ahead and went with the A team, which was George Bush, i.e. they concluded eventually that they could Teflonize Bush despite all of this incredible activity and sell him to the nation, and they did.
Why, though, did Dukakis, as the B team, not go after Bush more aggressively?
Because he's a member of the team. He's a member of the fraternity. Why did Dan Inouye? They had Ronald Reagan and George Bush by the short hairs. They could have impeached them, and they didn't, because they couldn't impeach a popular president like Reagan and Bush without losing control, the public trust. See, this gets back into the Howard Zinn thesis that the American Revolution occurred when the rich white people, rich white males over here, wanted to take power away from the same element in England, and they engineered a deal with the people whereby they would give more freedom to the people than they had under the monarchy or the colony. But nevertheless, the rich white males would retain control. And this dynamic relationship, we don't have a democracy. We do not, even to this day, vote for the president. We vote for electors who select the president. In addition to which, this two-party system we've evolved gives them further control, because even the selection of the candidates, it's done by about 50% vote, popular vote through the primaries, and about 50% through the frozen delegates, or the hard delegates, or the super delegates, who are party hacks, who control, the party machinery, controlling ultimately who gets nominated. This is why Pat Schroeder gave it a run and dropped out, is because her traveling and consulting with the super delegates, the frozen delegates, the power structure of the party, she was told she would not be permitted to win whatever happened, on the popular side of things. And then once that was decided, the money was not available to her. Now this system, as it has continued for 200 years, is a tenuous relationship in which the people who own the country, the people on the the Federal Reserve Board, the people who manage the money and the moneyed interest, the strength of the capitalist system, these people know that they're riding a potentially rebellious horse in the American people whose interests are not being fully served. Myth has to be maintained to make this thing run. And it's a constant balance of what do they have to give the people to keep them on board the system, and at what point are they going to lose the system. You read the history through Zen's eyes of the United States, or the Graham book on the history of violence in the United States, and you see that every time the people have become angry enough, the system has yielded to them. The labor struggles at the turn of the century, for example, the Vietnam War and Civil Rights days, when blacks rose up in the country with a massive boycott and it began to really hurt the economic interests.
And start burning down the small businesses in the ghettos, the white businesses
White
in the
business
ghettos.
and Detroit and Watts and 14th Street in Washington. And you know, when the system was breaking apart, the establishment yielded every time. And the system self-destructed. The cynicism of the Reagan years, in which one of the more dramatic transfers of wealth from the poor to the rich occurred, was orchestrated by Ronald Reagan through the arms race, the $2 trillion on arms, the mechanisms that he set up for him, the rigging of the taxes, where he could say taxes had been cut when they had been redistributed to hurt the middle class and poor more. This thing came to a head under the Iran-Contra scandal. And once again, the establishment was faced in the winter of '87. They were saying, we've had it, the people have had it, and we're going to have to give them the Democrats for a while. And they came up eventually with what was to them the perfect candidate was Dukakis, who had a reputation of being clean after the corruption of the Reagan years, who had a reputation of being somewhat of a populist, as Jimmy Carter did, who could be sold as a cleansing, sort of, as here, we sympathize, here, you can have your president for a while. The truth is that Jimmy Carter had foisted upon him Zbig Brzezinski, who was an utter fascist in his policies to control the national security decisions. So Carter's human rights stuff couldn't go too far, and he wound up setting in motion the arms buildup that eventually evolved into the Reagan arms buildup, which is the biggest peacetime buildup in the history of, the biggest buildup in the arms buildup in the history of the world.
And Brzezinski moved into the Bush camp during this campaign.
Indeed, and of course that's part of the October, the election held hostage. The Playboy article brings that out very clearly, is that having put, he doesn't get into their having put Carter in office to placate the people after Nixon, after Vietnam, after the civil rights struggle. That Zen gets into that, but they're taking it up at the end of the Carter era, where two things had happened. One is the Federal Reserve Board cooked the economy. And so we had runaway inflation, which would scare people. You could feel it, you could taste it, and the newspapers talked about it every day and blamed it on Carter. And when he doesn't control this stuff, the Federal Reserve Board does. And then the other thing was the national security establishment went after him with a passion. The CIA operatives cooperating with Bush Reagan during the presidential campaign of 1980, the Pentagon cooperating, McFarlane, their Marine officer working in the State Department advising, but having committed himself to the Bush side. All of these tendrils go back to the security establishment saying, okay, we've given them Carter for 4 years, now let's get back to work. And they got Reagan in there. To summarize, they got Reagan in there, and he eventually self-destructed, or the system self-destructed under his watch. They thought they were going to have to give us Dukakis to placate the people, and then they found that the people simply don't care enough. The people simply aren't vigilant enough of their own interests to care enough about this monumental corruption from George Bush and the people around him, and they were able to continue with the A-team in office with George Bush to extend and continue the policies of Ronald Reagan, to exploit the nation, and to keep in lockstep with the drug runners, not to mention the military machinery.